Hello.
Hi.
We're here with Laini Taylor, and she has just published the third in a trilogy, Dreams of Gods and Monsters, and the first was Daughter of Smoke and Bone. So we would really love to talk to you a little bit about how the whole thing got started.
I had been working on a book, a different book at the time, a science fiction novel that I had been really excited to start and which was not in any way working out. It was a miserable writing experience. And every day I would rather do anything besides write that book. And so after a few months of this, I finally decided to give myself a play day to write anything just for fun. And I had no plan, and just right away these characters came jumping onto the page, and it was a blue-haired teenage girl arguing with her father, who turned out to not be human. And all these things happened in that day of writing, which was the best writing day I think I've ever had. And it was completely unplanned, and it was not in any way a book or the beginning of a book, but I fell so in love with those characters that I started asking questions about the scene that had happened that day, and gradually, organically, it did grow into a book and then ultimately a trilogy.
Are you sad that it's over?
You know, I'm actually kind of relieved.
Yeah.
There is certainly sadness, and especially right away at the end. But I left them in a place that I'm glad to leave them. You know, I have closure, and I'm right now just really excited about new story ideas and looking ahead.
So I have to ask the great Hollywood question. Movie rights, plans?
Oh yes, the movie is in development at Universal, and with the Roth Company producing.
Nice.
And we have a director, Michael Gracie, and a script by Jez Butterworth, which is in the final stages. So we're all very excited.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Do you remember how old you were when you knew you were going to be a writer?
I don't remember, because I never remember a time when I didn't want to be a writer.
Right.
And so I would say, at least 4, because books were always the thing I loved the most. And I remember, from a very young age, not quite that young, but I sitting on the porch, writing stories. And I don't really remember seriously ever wanting to do anything else.
Right.
That said, I was 35 before I finished my first novel, so it did take a while.
Right. So were there books or authors you read at any time, especially when you were young, that inspired you, fueled your desires to be a writer?
I had a really sort of spotty, reading career, I guess. I was a Navy brat, so we moved a lot, and we usually didn't have English language bookstores or libraries, or at least not really reliable ones. And so I read a lot of adult fantasy, I think, what you could get at the Navy PX that was geared towards 20-year-old sailors, But I do remember really loving Madeleine L'Engle. She was, she's one of the sort of highlights of my childhood reading. And I don't recall if there was a particular inspiration to become a writer, but her books just showed not just her fantasy, but also her contemporary fiction, a way of sort of just these big lives in the world full of travel and young people doing interesting things, and it was very inspiring. Yeah.
So you have done a lot of travel writing. Prague plays a big role in your trilogy. Talk a bit about that, if you would.
Sure. About 10 years ago, my husband's an illustrator, and we had done a graphic novel together. It was both of our first book. And we wanted to do our second one. It was going to be a vampire book. So we traveled to Prague to research it. And this was in the pre-Twilight vampire. Vampires are still fair game years. And we spent a lot of time in Prague deciding where the vampires hunt in Prague. And it was really fun. But right after that, I got interested in my first novel and continued to finish that, and so we never did that book. And so when I was figuring out what to do with this blue-haired girl and her monster father, it just seemed natural that they would live in Prague, and it became the perfect Gothic fairy tale setting.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a city that can be in all times.
Yeah,
all times.
Absolutely.
Ancient and modern and everything. It's cool about how integral it is to the books.
Yeah, it feels like a fairy tale, but it's real, and real people, contemporary people are living there doing normal things, and yet it has this ambiance.
Right, it's fantastic. Did you study writing in college and grad school, and where do you fall in the conversation about whether writing can be taught?
I did not study it. I was an English major. If I had it to do over, I would be a history major, and the reason is that I just think you can always read fiction on your own a little bit more easily than you can sort of like synthesize history for your own consumption.
Right.
I did take a writing workshop in college, and then some sort of during the college years, but outside of the school environment. But it took me a long time to actually find my voice as a writer. I was trying to write literary fiction at that point, and I wasn't having much fun with it. And it was sort of years later, when I started reading fantasy again, that I found my voice as a writer. I think that, I don't know if writing can be, I mean, I think up to a point, I went to art school as well, and I think that there's, writing, like with art, you can improve so much more than you ever maybe thought you would with a lot of practice if you're willing to devote yourself to it. Then there's always that unknown, unquantifiable thing that some people have that can't be taught, but I think a lot of it can be taught.
All right, one more question.
Okay.
If you were not a writer, what do you think you would have been?
I don't know what I would have been, but if I had it to do over and I couldn't be a writer, it's hard, but I think that the life sciences would be really fascinating. My sister's a biologist, and I think, not to say that I'm, in any way qualified to do this, but I think that would be a really interesting life, or the arts in some way.
Nice, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Laini Taylor. Finished the trilogy, Dreams of Gods and Monsters. A pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.